Hello everyone, and welcome to this Eastbourne Making Natural History presentation on nature's principles of harmony. My name is Richard Dunn. I am the Director of Education for the Harmony Project. And in this presentation today, I'd like to share with you nature's principles of harmony and how I believe they can guide and inform a new way of learning. So let me bring up the slide presentation so that we can begin. And as I've just mentioned, this presentation today is focused around this question: how nature's principles of harmony can inspire a new way of learning to live. As some of you may know, there was a recent WWF report that highlighted that 68% of our biodiversity globally has disappeared in just 50 years. That's an extraordinary figure and a damning indictment of the way we are currently living. The CEO of WWF International said that nature is unraveling and our planet is flashing red warning signs. A deep cultural and systemic shift is urgently needed. So it's clear that the current status quo is not going to work if we want to create truly sustainable ways of living. In addition to that, we've seen this year wildfires across the world that have been unprecedented. And I was struck by this Greta Thunberg quote from last year: "I want you to act as if our house is on fire," because it is. This sense of urgency, the need to do things differently, so important. And of course, at the other end of the world, on the polar ice caps, we have this ice melt leading to sea level rises and destabilizing, or part of the destabilization of our climate. And linked to that, we have and we rely on an incredibly industrialized monoculture farming system, or systems, with their very damaging use of nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides. And this is degrading, damaging our soil, our air, and our water. And again, there's a need to look at how we can become much more sustainable, regenerative in our farming practices, so that we work in balanced relationship with the natural world. On top of everything else, we are dealing currently with this pandemic, and it's had devastating consequences for us. And it's a sign that our relationship with the natural world is not right. And the concern is that global pandemics like COVID-19 may occur again unless we change the way we work. So in that context, I wanted today to talk about this word harmony and principles of harmony that we see in nature. And as you can see here, harmony has a number of different meanings, and this list is not an exhaustive one, but it does draw out elements of balance. It's about health and wholeness, relationships. When we see harmony in nature, we see it working systemically and cyclically. It's diverse and inclusive. And this important message that it's about the one, the individual, and the whole, the oneness. And of course, we see in the natural world that its outcomes are beautiful, and harmony is founded on a set of universal laws or principles. So I hope that what I share gives you a real sense of how we could reframe learning around this idea of harmony. Earlier this year, I published this book, A New Way of Looking at and Learning About Our World, informed by principles of harmony. It's based on many years of practice and development in a state primary school. So it's very real and real life applied as well. And at the beginning of the book, there is a foreword by the Prince of Wales, who, as many of you will know, is passionate about how we live in harmonious relationship with nature. And he highlights in the fourth paragraph: unless we recognize how nature strives for health by seeking harmony, and understand that we too are very much part of this integrated self-sustaining system, then we will continue to struggle in our response to the major crises we face. So this real understanding of our connection to nature, not just that, an understanding that we are nature, and the way our bodies work has a strong relation relationship to the way the natural world around us works too. One of the quotes in his book, Harmony, A New Way of Looking at the World, is this: all we have to see is that the solutions are close at hand. And by that, I think he means these principles in nature, which can act as a starting point for this new way of learning to live. This quote is one that I heard from someone recently who runs Ubiquity University, and it really struck a chord. If you don't start with the fundamental principles of life, you will go astray. So how might we guide and inform learning with these principles so that our young people grow up not going astray, but with a really strong sense of how they can live in the world? So I'm going to share 7 principles of harmony with you. And the first principle I want to share is this principle of interdependence, that nature teaches us that everything is connected. And as an example, there are many examples that we can explore on this idea of interdependence. This particular project is looking at bees and understanding how they work as an interdependent whole. Here we see children looking at the bee honeycomb in a beehive and understanding how the colony works together. So bees, of course, are central to the health of the wider ecosystem, pollinating flowers, and they teach us through their interrelationships and their work together the systemic nature of life. And of course, the local honey, the outcome of this good work, is good for us too. So bees pollinate flowers, and flowers provide nectar for bees. We see in nature, for all that we talk about survival of the fittest and competition, we see more than that, a world of collaboration. This is a friend of mine, Patrick Holden, who is the CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust. He is an organic farmer, and this is one of his fields on his organic farm in Wales. So he's working in harmonious relationship with nature through the systems and the practices that he's developed over many years to run an organic farm in Wales. So we can see that when our farming is healthy, it is in this good relationship, and when it's not, it's usually because of the industrialized practices that we are using that are so damaging and polluting to our elements. So in terms of ideas around projects of learning, and this approach is very much project-based, here are some examples of projects that can be developed with children in a primary phase. And of course, you can develop this further into secondary and indeed beyond. But we've got projects linked to the body working together, a seaside, a project done just before the summer holidays when children may go to the beach, the bees ecosystem that you've just had a look at, fair trade and our interconnected world, community and the interdependence of people, oceans and plastic waste and pollution, something that so many of our young people are passionate about and concerned about, and the Antarctic ecosystem and the link between ice melt and climate change. So this approach is very much helping children and young people to think systemically. So the way of developing this understanding of harmony is, in my opinion and from my experience, best done through inquiries of learning, these big questions that overarch the project or the learning that takes place over half a term. And every time there's a project, there's a link to a sustainability theme, which relates directly to the principle of harmony. So it's really joining up the learning to make it make sense. The second principle is this principle of the cycle, that nature teaches us self-sustaining, self-regulating cycles. And these cycles never end, they keep going, and they are a model of sustainability. So if we look at food and the cycle of seed to fruit to seed, these green peppers sliced open full of seeds, which will create the plants and the fruit for the next cycle. So a really lovely example of bringing the idea of cycle to work, and where this is done well in schools where there's a lot of food growing happening, it's a great way to link into this understanding of cycles. So as a process, the magic of seeds starting to grow, leading to our role working with these plants to make sure that they're watered well and weeded and looked after. And then the joy of harvest time, when we reap the rewards of all that hard work and we take that food and we make delicious dishes and share the food together. So a really strong sense of the food that we grow leading to food that we eat and share together. And of course, if we're looking at this idea of cycle, we need to close the loop, and any food waste is then composted back into the soil. It needs to go through a process, of course, of breakdown, so that the food is actually fully broken down as compost that can then be put out onto the soil, so the seeds can be planted again. So there we have a new cycle beginning the following year, with the goodness of the food waste feeding back in, rather like the leaves that fall in autumn going back into the soil to give the good nutrients for the next cycle to start. So this is an example of a cycle that we can see in many forms in the natural world. But of course, many of our practices, indeed most of our practices, are not cyclical. They create waste, they create pollution, and it's one of the big challenges that we face now as we look to build and develop cyclical systems so that our finite resources can be sustained. So nature's eternal cycles ensure that nothing ever ends, and this is a great way for us to see how we can live sustainably too. Recycling, reusing. And again, just to give some examples of how this cycle can be explored in different ways, we've got 7 projects here, projects of learning linking to farm animals and life cycles of animals, flowering plants, traditions and traditional stories being passed on, the cycle of trees through the seasons, the solar system, the water cycle, which children will all learn about and can learn a lot from, and indigenous peoples like the Inuit of the Arctic, who can teach us through their traditional practices ways of living in harmony with nature. So cyclical systems, an essential part of a sustainable future. The third principle is this principle of diversity. And nature teaches us that diversity gives a system strengths, it makes it resilient, it's a good thing, it's something to celebrate. And the more we develop this understanding and become experts in diversity, and here biodiversity, the more we're likely to want to do something about it, to care about it, to contribute to sustaining it. So here are some examples of things that we can do: planting wildflower meadows to encourage local biodiversity and learning the names of the different flowers, planting fruit orchards, and again, developing this sense of diversity in fruit orchards. So each sapling, each tree is a different species, a different heritage variety of fruit, something we can learn about and become experts in. And of course, we can do it in other areas of food production here, growing carrots in diversity and exploring taste in different types of carrots. And this whole area of diversity in us, celebrating diversity in who we are, valuing it, and very consciously promoting it. So allowing for difference in outcomes of learning, and most importantly, valuing difference in individuals within the community. So here are some examples of diversity at work in different projects. Diversity starting very much with ourselves and valuing difference, and difference in how we learn, in how we develop our talents and our potential, but then also looking at diversity more broadly in relation to biodiversity, food, and indeed community, and the different roles that people play in community. So as it says at the bottom, it's something to preserve and indeed to promote. The next principle is the principle of adaptation. We see in the natural world these remarkable adaptations of different species who have adapted over their evolutionary processes, millions of years, and are so well suited to their place. And nature's designs have so much still to teach us. It's one of the reasons why it's so important for us to nurture and protect natural environments and biodiversity. We still have so much to learn in this world of biomimicry. So here we see examples of bee honeycomb on the left and some of the biomes of the Eden Project in Cornwall on the right. So what kind of future might we be creating if we want to adapt to issues of climate change and so on? And how sustainable will the models we create be? This is a question that a lot of young people are really interested in and something that is important to explore with them. So in terms of learning, adaptation can open up real opportunities to localize learning, to link to community. These children here, year sixes, doing a Dig for Victory project, making seasonal soups in relation to the Second World War and Dig for Victory, and sharing them with elders within the community, grandparents and elders that they've invited in prior to Harvest Festival. So much of our learning, as we know, is very focused on the past. There's nothing wrong with that. But of course, if we focus too much on the past, it doesn't give us enough time to think about the future and the future that we might create and that we can be part of. So how might we shift the balance slightly so that we recognize what we can learn from the past and the skills and knowledge of history that are so valuable, but also how that can influence what we do in the future? This is an organization called Teach the Future, a group of passionate young students who are looking at how their learning can be more future orientated and interdisciplinary. So here we see examples of adaptation to local contexts, ways in which children and students can learn and connect to their local area through projects that are geographical, historical, community-based, and so on, and building a real sense of identity to community. The fifth principle is the principle of health. Nature teaches us what we need to be well. And when we look at natural systems, we see healthy systems at work. So this is an expedition to Chamonix in the Alps with year 6 children focused on health and well-being. And the program is divided into 3 elements: individual well-being, when am I well? And beyond base needs of sleeping well, being safe, eating well, drinking well, etc. These are some of the things that these young people think are important. So well-being is about being valued, learning new things, standing up for what they believe in, realizing their potential, and then lower down, connecting to nature and having time to be still, to reflect, to pray, to meditate, and so on. These are really important elements for their well-being, and indeed all of ours. The second focus, and this is a trekking day in the mountains, is on team well-being and looking at when a team is well, not just discussing it, but actually living it out, going on a long, hard trek and thinking about what a team needs to be well. So these young people sharing that when a team is well, it's when everyone has a say, when there's good communication, when we enjoy what we're doing, when we see need and respond to it. What a great message that is for all of us. And then the final element is this element of global well-being, and such a critical aspect of learning now that we really think ahead to what our world needs as we grow up and as our children grow up in terms of well-being. So here are some summary statements from these young people, and they make a lot of sense. If we can live like this, then we are certainly moving in the right direction. And their final point here, that when we all grow as leaders, seeing their role as leaders, as taking responsibility for the actions above and making sure that we do live sustainably and well, is a key element in what they want to share. It's interesting to note that at this time where people are finding solace in nature so much wherever they can, and for some that's easier than others, that there is now a campaign to introduce a nature premium. It's being promoted by the Forest School Association. And this campaign is to see, rather like the sports premium, to see if it's possible to fund time in nature for young people every week in some shape or form. It might be through a forest school activity, it might be through a gardening club, it might be through learning in nature. So something to watch out for and support, of course. These are some examples of projects that link to health. It's probably the most important thing that we learn about in our lives, isn't it? What we need to be healthy. And when we're healthy, then everything else seems to work so much better. When we're sick or ill, it's so much harder. So what are the elements of health that we can develop? And of course, this list, which goes up to year 6, could develop into year 7, 8, and on. There are so many different aspects to our health. So the 6th principle is this principle of oneness. And I've got one last one, the principle of geometry, which I'll come onto in just a moment. But this principle of oneness is about seeing that all these principles are ultimately one and the same thing. We might explore them in different ways, but they ultimately come together as one. And this recognition too, that we are nature, we are one or at one with nature. So the more we can give time to finding our peace in nature, the better. And many of us have experienced that during the challenges of lockdown during the pandemic, and it's a good thing for children. So in terms of projects, here are projects that help our young people understand that we are part of something greater, whether we see it as one planet, whether we see it as our solar system or the cosmos, or whether we see it in terms of a religious aspect, for example, around God and our place in the world. So we are all one in nature. This symbol here is the Japanese and indeed the Chinese symbol for harmony. And it's 2 symbols, as you can see. And one of the symbols stands for stillness and the other for symphony. So you've got this lovely balance between the stillness and the symphony, the creating great music or great acts and performance, but alongside that, the stillness that goes with it. It's a lovely combination in this, this translation of harmony into Japanese and Chinese. So I mentioned this final principle, this principle of geometry, that there is a pattern to nature, a pattern to life, and we see that pattern in the world around us, but we also see it in us. So this is a cherry on, or a berry on a plant that I saw just last weekend in late autumn, and it has this extraordinary pentagon shape at the end of it. And if we look at a cross section of a carrot, we can see this pentagon shape there, not in all carrots, sometimes it's circles, but different forms. This is a cross section of that same pentagon shape. I don't know whether many of you have seen this image before, but this is the orbit of Earth and Venus around the sun. It creates a perfect 5-petaled flower, and it takes 8 Earth years and 13 Venus years. So we've got numbers in the Fibonacci sequence creating this 5-petaled flower, and it's the same shape as this tiny flower that we might see in a garden or a woodland. So one last example here is this cross section of an apple, where we again see this 5-ness and the seeds held within this 5-petaled flower form. So what we're doing with the Harmony Project work now is we're developing these beautiful examples of nature's geometry that children, young people, adults too can join in with and really learn to see these patterns and then recreate them. So here's a starfish in the same pentagon form. Here's the reflective symmetry of a bee, a honeybee, and of course there are many examples of bees that could be designed in this way. Here is a fish using this vesica shape, where you have 2 overlapping circles together, and it creates this form which we can use for a fish and other examples in nature. This is the 6-petaled flower using 7 circles, and this 6-petaled flower form here is one of a number of examples of 6-ness. We could look at the diversity of flower species in this 6-ness formation. And there's the human eye, and just an example here, one of a number where we can look at how the human form also has this geometric shape. So I mentioned the numbers in the Fibonacci spiral and sequence. Here are some examples of Fibonacci spirals of growth in nature. We've got here on the left the fern and a shell on the right. We have cloud formations. Indeed, we can see it in galaxies of stars in the same proportion. And on the right, the curled up finger, our curled up finger. This reference across from the world around us to us, that we are nature. I don't know if any of you know Fritjof Capra, who's a big systems thinker and a brilliant man. And he highlighted this quote: from a systems point of view, the understanding of a life begins with the understanding of pattern. So we are nature. Leonardo da Vinci here with his Vitruvian Man image, looking at the proportions of nature and those proportions in relation to the wider world. So how does this approach get delivered? Well, what we do, I mentioned the geometry at the end because that runs through everything, but we have 6 half terms, and each half term has a principle that underpins the learning, and the learning is focused around an inquiry. And you can see for each half term, we also have a sustainability project or a sustainability theme that runs through the work. So all the time, year on year, half term on half term, we're developing an understanding of how things can work if they are to be sustainable. So this is a year 4 overview. You've got adaptation here linking into local history. You've got interdependence and building community and relationships. You've got cycles of solar systems, stars and the diversity of star constellations, the Egyptians and oneness, and then food, and when food is at its best and most healthy. Another example here in year 5 of different principles and how they relate. So we have over time in this example had to rework some of the projects or change them in some way so that they really do fit, because you don't want to shoehorn things into principles if they don't really work. But as you can see here, this approach can, with some careful consideration, can be very successful. So just to give you another way of seeing and understanding that this approach, these are examples that we have on the Harmony Project, a new website which is coming out very shortly. We have examples of overviews of learning, these half-termly plans that have the inquiry question at the top, the Harmony principle linked to it, and then all the learning, and I'll explain this through these next slides, explained throughout. So another example here linked into what we were talking about earlier with the bees. So the great work at the end of this is the celebration of the learning, hexagonal books about bees. So referencing the hexagon shapes of the bee honeycomb and using each page of this hexagonal book to explain or describe an element of how bees work so well together, reinforcing this message of interdependence. So all the time looking at partners in learning, and the sustainability here, simply caring for bees in whatever way that may be. Another example, this one now, on how can we ensure our oceans stay amazing. And you'll see in the bold at the top of the weekly questions that there is this specific overarching question which takes children, students on a journey of learning to this great work outcome. So they're very clear that in each project, they're developing their understanding, their knowledge and their skills, and then they're using that in some way to share and celebrate their work. One last example here is Antarctica worth protecting. Again, referencing this idea of interdependence, seeing that the Antarctic is an interdependent system, and we are also part of that broader system. So the way we live and the way we behave can have an impact, as it is already doing, on Antarctica. So you've got your weekly questions down below, the geometry and the science, which is the primary focus for this project. And then of course you've got English and maths core skills. So the core skills will be practiced and then embedded through this approach. Great works are an important part of this process. You've got examples here of great works which cover a range of different age groups, but in essence, as I mentioned just now, this idea of great works is about celebration of learning. So children and students don't just see their learning as an assessment or a test, they see it as something related to what they've done and achieved through a project over half a term. So here are these principles of harmony, the principle of interdependence and projects of learning that teach us how systems work, this idea of the cycle, projects of learning that highlight the importance of cycles in sustainable living, the principle of diversity and promoting diversity in all things, the principle of adaptation, and this idea of a sense of place and a sense of peace and local learning, the principle of health to help us to understand what it means to be well, and this idea of oneness and being reminded that we are all one in nature. So then we have this running principle, this principle of geometry that threads through all the learning and gives us a different way of seeing the world. This is a quote that Tim Schmidt, the founder of the Eden Project, shared with me recently, and I thought it was a brilliant quote. We need to be asking not what sort of planet we are leaving our children, but what sort of children we are leaving our planet. So my view, and maybe it's the view of a number of you, is that we need an education revolution right now. We absolutely need to maintain good and high standards in core learning in reading, writing, maths, etc. But we also need to give that a context. We need to reframe learning, in my opinion, so that nature and these principles of harmony that are in nature can teach us how to learn to live in a way that is sustainable, resilient, healthy, and good for all life. So that's what the work of the Harmony Project is doing. It's wonderful to be part of this Eastbourne Making Natural History event and indeed program. And we look forward to partnering with Eastbourne and developing the thinking around all the exciting work that's being developed over the coming months and years. And if you want to contact me, that's my email at the bottom, richarddunn@theharmonyproject.org.uk, and our website there too. These slides will be available through the Eastbourne Making Natural History project. So I'll just come out of this presentation now, and thank you all very much for listening to what I've had to share. I hope it's been interesting for you, and please do come back to me on my email if you have any further questions about the work of the Harmony Project. Many thanks for your time. Bye-bye.